my worst gig was the time the Dalai Lama called me fat. Now, you might think this is some kind of metaphor, or, you know, I promise you can Google this. The Dalai Lama, living God to 50 million Tibetans, man renowned all over the world for his compassion not only for all living things but for inanimate objects. Hated being called me fat. I say I think that was the worst gig I ever did because there were a couple that compete. I used to do this thing on Sky News where me, Una King, nice former Labour MP, and Rachel Whetstone, vile Tory person, used to comment on the rolling news for like an hour every Friday. And it was quite, you know, it was quite fun. You didn't know what was going to happen. And one week, John Major was in the studio and he was saying this thing that, you know, he says every year, which was, when I set up the National Lottery, it was only meant to fund, you know, arts and sport. Now they use it for like the NHS. The government had got their fingers in the till. They were sitting in the corner and I wasn't really paying attention. They suddenly cut back to me and they said, Johann, John Major says the government's got its fingers in the till. What do you say? And without really thinking, I said, well, it's better than having your fingers in a win a curry. The people in the studio didn't react like you. And as I was being marched out of the Sky News studio, past John Major, whose lips are not thick at the best of times, but I said a little bit too loudly, but he did finger a win a curry. And maintains my defence. Although, actually, weirdly, that's not even the most shaming thing I've said on live television. About 2 weeks ago, I don't know if you've been following this, there's been 2 weeks ago I was on CNN, there's been a series of horrendous suicides in the iPad factories in China, because they're, like, enslaved and don't like it. And I was talking about this, and I was talking about a guy called, I was against this monstrous guy from Bloomberg News who basically thinks Chinese people like being enslaved. And I was saying, you know, it's terrible, and I was giving an example of a guy called Liu Chan, who was 35 and died after doing a 35-hour shift in the iPad factory. Unfortunately, what I said was that he died, Liu Chan, did my best somber face, and I said, Liu Chan died after doing a 35-hour shit in the iPad factory. I didn't know I'd done this, so I thought, oh, you're a bit pussy, right? And then when I got back, I had loads of tweets from people saying, this poor man must have been in agony! And I don't know if the worst thing, I think maybe the worst thing about my job is, because you constantly get mistaken for things you're not. I remember after I'd been at The Independent for about 6 months, I got this really lovely, I mean, one of the nicest letters still I've ever had. It was like a 3-page handwritten letter. And she said, you know, one of the things I love about, yeah, really lovely. And at the end she said, one of the things I most love about The Independent is you've got such a diverse range of columnists. You know, you've got a gay man, a Muslim woman, and now with you a Down syndrome columnist. I think you are an inspiration to Down syndrome people everywhere. And I phoned my mother because I was like upset, and my mum said, you know, son, that's a bit weird because when you were born, I thought you were Down syndrome. Is it possible that you just have a little bit of an extra chromosome? I have been mistaken for worse things. I was, every year I go with Comic Relief somewhere in the world to one of their projects and write about it. And last year I was waiting at a bus stop. And you know, you don't really think when you're talking on mobile, you don't really think about people around you. And Sophie from Comic Relief called me and I said, oh Sophie, I'm so glad you rang. I really realised that I was standing in front of 20 people and I talked quite loudly. Sophie, I'm so glad you called because I've been looking on your website and I think I know exactly what I want to do this year. I've been checking out those child prostitutes you guys do in Bangladesh and they are perfect. And I've spoken to my bosses, they are totally up for it as well. The only thing is I know how sensitive this is, but we'd have to get some kind of pictures or video. I don't know if that's something we could do. And I kind of looked up and there were all these people staring at me about to lynch me, and so I very quickly changed the subject. As I'm going to do now, because you don't think paedophile jokes are funny. So the Dalai Lama, His Holiness. I interviewed him about 7 years ago. And everyone who ever interviews the Dalai Lama, it always goes the same way. They basically say, Your Holiness, you're the best person I've ever met. Could I rent a small flat somewhere up your arsehole for the next day? And I don't really believe in doing that, because I think whoever you're interviewing, if they're a powerful and influential person, you know, you should challenge them on the difficult things. And while obviously the Chinese occupation of Tibet is horrendous, you know, it's worth bearing in mind when the Dalai Lama ran Tibet, until he was forced out, it was a slave-owning theocracy. He did personally own 17,000 serfs. He's terrible on all sorts of issues. He says disabled people are being punished for what they did in a previous life. He's really anti-gay. He said anal sex is wrong because you shouldn't use the other holes. You know, it's one of my favourite hobbies, so I was bound to disagree with him. he's really in favour of the Indian nuclear weapons programme, which most people don't know about him, which doesn't seem very zen to me. So I thought, I'll ask him these questions. And he's obviously just never asked anything critical, because after about 15 minutes he's getting really narky. And he started pretending he didn't speak English. I started saying, I do not understand, I'm like, Your Holiness, I've just seen you give an hour-long lecture in English, I know you understand what I'm saying. And he was getting really narky, and his goons, because there's this little platoon of goons always with him, started saying, "You're out of time now!" And I was like, you said an hour, it's been like 15 minutes. So I thought, okay, I'm going to bring it back to something where we agree. So I said, Your Holiness, you've always been very critical of income inequality in the West. And he said, yeah, I don't see why people need so much money, we each only have one stomach. Then paused and said, except you. You clearly have at least three. And I kind of paused and I thought, my God, is the Dalai Lama calling me a manta? So I said, well, Your Holiness, you're not exactly skinny yourself. Led to my expulsion from my interview with Dalai Lama. After I wrote about this, I received the world's first ever Buddhist death threat. I got to email back and say, well mate, your karma is fucked. So I'd just like to leave you with the thought that when you next see a banner saying Free Tibet, I urge you to reply by saying, no, enslave the fuckers, and their evil God. Thank you very much.